In the mid-1940s, during World War II, the Japanese government indoctrinated a nationalist mindset into its citizens in an attempt to increase support for their empire. Army drills were taught in schools, small children sang songs of patriotism, and citizens were prepared to die for their country's victory. Schools were often required to provide students as nurses and soldiers, and such practices often replaced regular schooling. Despite being forcefully drafted as nurses, a group of schoolgirls on the Japanese island of Okinawa were still prepared to support the war effort for their country, believing that their nation was bound to win the war. While the triumph of the Allies landing on Okinawan soil prevented a Japanese victory, the Japanese mindset of nationalism led to the tragedy, as many young girls were drafted to nurse hundreds of Japanese soldiers. Subsequently, a dissolution order was written, after which a majority of these female students were tragically killed. Today, much of the Okinawan population and culture tragically lies decimated. Years after these events, an advocacy for peace was started by the surviving students, preserving the presence of peace which is still prevalent in modern Japan. The Empire of Japan has always been a nation triumphantly empowered by ideals of nationalism. The emperor was always a highly valued, godlike person. Education was overtaken by these values. These ideals were indoctrinated throughout thousands of years before being exposed to the modern world. Before World War II, this mindset of nationalism can be clearly seen, largely in the Japanese educational system. Before the threat of war ravaged Japan, schools had ongoing regular classes, and cities had started becoming more modern, maintaining old ideals as well as fashion from the West. However, by 1941, army drills and nursing practices often replaced regular classes. Male students were taught to train like soldiers and use weapons, while female students were taught to administer medicine and anesthetics and clean bandages. Situations during the early years of World War II were not yet as dire as they would later become. However, the public started witnessing a nationalist mindset indoctrinated into students. These ideas spread from island to island across the Japanese Empire and included the island of Okinawa. Schools were not only required to teach their students war practices, they were also required to provide their students for the war effort. Students were drafted as young soldiers, nurses, and laborers. Groups like the Blood and Iron Corps and the Himeyuri Corps were now thrust into the forefront of war. We were taught that Japan was God's country and couldn't lose the war. Tragically, some of the schools which were affected by the drafting orders were the Okinawa Daiichi Women's High School and the Okinawa Shihan Women's School. Both of these schools coexisted together. They were all girls' schools, with students ranging from the ages of 15 to 19 years old. These young girls were exactly the same as teenage girls are today. They talked together with their friends, gossiped with each other, and laughed together. These girls lived in boarding houses, which were on school grounds. Many of the girls aspired to be future teachers and instructors. Most changes occurred during the war, starting with the Okinawan schools, which brought frequent air raids on villages and cities. The original school uniforms, which were sailor-like outfits with skirts, were quickly replaced with protective hoods, or bokuzukin, with fixed kimonos, which were much more versatile and made running and jumping easier in the event of an air raid. Another noteworthy change made to the schools directly affected the students' classes and schooling subjects. Many schools began to teach their students army drills and nursing practices, and women's schools were not exempt from this practice. These female students were often brought to local hospitals to learn how to administer medicine and change bandages. Yoshimura Hideko, a survivor of the Himeyuri Corps, stated that they grew up during wartime and received an education whose goal was to nurture people willing to die for the emperor, and we believed that Japan was fighting a holy war that was to bring happiness to all Asian people. In March of 1945, Okinawan schoolgirls were attending a normal school day when the school announced the drafting of many of its students. This announcement was ordered by the Japanese military. The students left the safety of their schools willingly, prepared to serve their country. Assisting the war effort was a highly admirable action in Japanese society. The girls believed that Japan would quickly be victorious in only a matter of days, and so they brought personal belongings to the cave shelters such as bags, textbooks, journals, food, and clothing. The hospital units were housed in 50 to 60 different caves all over the island. They named themselves the Himeyuri Corps. Himeyuri translated to Princess Lily, a word derived from the students' school song. The caves on Okinawa served as shelters awaiting wounded Japanese soldiers for the girls to help. Life in the cave shelters was slow and dull. Every so often, a few soldiers would be brought into the shelters in order to be treated. Supplies were scarce, and much of the time, soldiers could not be saved from their injuries. The girls' stay in the caves was prolonged more than they anticipated. The situation in the caves quickly turned chaotic. By April 1st, 1945, Okinawa quickly turned into a bloody battleground. Tragically, Okinawan citizens were not spared from the violence, and at times, soldiers turned against their own citizens in order to save themselves. Life in the caves became appalling. Living conditions deteriorated. With an immense amount of violence occurring outside of the caves, wounded soldiers poured into the caves. There was so little room in between lying down soldiers that students often had to step on the wounded soldiers. Supplies and medicine became even more scarce, and soldiers could not be treated. Some were given milk laced with cyanide to end their lives. At times, students had to hold soldiers down as their limbs were amputated. We only had basic training in how to put on bandages, but the wounded soldiers they brought in were beyond help. Hygiene in general was poor at best. So many soldiers were dying in the caves that the students were tasked with disposing of corpses outside of the caves in the midst of artillery fire. I thought it was only a matter of time before we were killed, but I decided to live to my limit and stumbled on. Another issue faced by the Himeyuri girls was the declining food supply. Food was generally reserved for the military, so the students could only eat a rice ball a day. Water was either found from outside or caught from the cave ceiling. Although these living conditions were indeed terrible, it would be nothing compared to what awaited the girls in the following months. On June 18, 1945, a dissolution order was given to the nursing unit. The order explained that the Himeyuri unit was to be disbanded, was no longer in operation, and was to leave the cave shelters at once. Essentially, the students were to be forced out of the shelters by the very people they'd been risking their life to protect for the past couple of months. If the order was disobeyed, students could be killed by the Japanese Imperial Army. The female students were sent out in groups, some at gunpoint with at least one teacher. Yoshimura remembers feeling betrayed. We worked hard to save the lives of the soldiers, believing that our country would win, so we were mortified to learn that we had lost and were thrown into the battlefield. Up until the dissolution order, only 19 students had been killed as a casualty of war. However, on the morning of June 19, 1945, the 3rd Surgery Shelter was attacked by U.S. forces. By July 1st, just 1 week after the dissolution order, 70% of the total student and teacher population lay dead. 123 Himeyuri students out of the 222 students and 18 teachers died outside of the Okinawan caves. Most of the deaths had been caused by violence outside of the caves. However, many of the students had also committed suicide. Some of the girls had grenades, others jumped from a popular cliff next to a beach which was notorious for Okinawan suicides during the Battle of Okinawa. Dubbed the Suicide Cliff, it is now a war memorial named the Cornerstone of Peace in honor of the Himeyuri girls and other Okinawan citizens, their sacrifices, and their tragedies. If a student was not killed, they could be sent to internment camps set up by the American Army. In these camps, malaria and disease went rampant, especially in the young and the elderly. Many girls knew their days ahead were marred in personal tragedy. Americans and Okinawans alike who visit the Okinawa memorials and parks dedicated to the souls lost in the war continue to reverberate their message. Don't let this happen again. In 1989 in Itoman, Okinawa, survivors of the events opened a peace memorial called the Himeyuri Peace Museum. The focus of the museum is to emphasize the suffering that their friends endured and to give visitors just a small taste of what life in the caves was like for the Himeyuri girls. The walls of the museum are lined with photos of each and every student which attended the women's schools, along with descriptions of their deaths. Since the museum opened, less than 10 survivors now remain out of the 104 that initially survived the American victory at Okinawa. The tragedy of the Himeyuri girls cannot be washed away the same as the blood-stained sand of the Okinawa beaches. Half of the Himeyuri girls lost their lives within the caves of Okinawa. 149,000 Okinawans died, 74,000 Japanese soldiers died, and 50,000 United States soldiers perished during the Battle of Okinawa. The survivors now task themselves with passing the responsibility to young people to tell their tragic stories. After the Battle of Okinawa, a large portion of the Okinawan civilization and culture had tragically been wiped out. The suffering of the citizens of this small Japanese island, annexed by Japan over a century ago, had been accentuated by a war in which they were unwillingly pulled into. Hundreds of students like the Himeyuri girls were thrust into the forefront of war as children, and are now speaking out against the erasure of events like these in history, and towards building a world in which peace can be valued in 2019. Shimabukuro Yoshiko and dozens of others are giving our next generation an opportunity to eradicate the hatred of the past in an effort to triumphantly offer the future a better world, one where peace can govern over nationalism and war. No matter how much the world changes, I want the next generation to resolutely convey the preciousness of peace.